I don't know how I got it, but I got a scoop that McDonald's had to concede internally. There was a bunch more trans fats in their French fries than they ever said publicly. Now, that was a huge deal. McDonald's basically saying there was more bad shit in their French fries. It was picked up by CNN, Fox, all the TV networks, because, I mean, who doesn't love a McDonald's story? And I suspect that the Wall Street Journal and others were not best pleased that this Financial Times publication wasn't staying in its lane and had done something that was, you would expect them to have got. So that was quite a satisfying scoop.
How did you end up in Chicago?
I landed in Chicago in the first half of 2002 and was posted there with another Financial Times staff correspondent who I was actually married to at the time. And we were sent to Chicago from London to staff up the FT bureau, which had been previously one person and we were two. So the FT doubled its headcount in Chicago. And the reason for that was the then editor had decided that the Chicago futures exchanges was a really important story that we really needed to get even further to grips with. I think it's fair to say the Financial Times was already making the running with the futures exchanges in the US, but we wanted to double down on that. In the month or two since after I arrived in Chicago, two massive things happened. One was the advent of electronic trading in Chicago, in large part thanks to the challenge that was mounted by the European exchange Eurex by setting up a US futures exchange in competition with the Chicago Board of Trade. That was number one. A little bit later, Euronext.LIFFE tried to launch an exchange, if I'm remembering this correctly, to compete against the CME, as was the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. So there was this basically European electronic screens were being used as a battering ram to knock down Fortress Chicago. That was the one big thing that was happening. And the second big thing that was happening as well was the demutualization of the Chicago exchanges, which of course led to the IPO of the CME back then, which I believe was in sort of Q3, Q4 of 2002, for the bargain basement price that we now know of as $34 a share.
What is the first story you can remember writing?
The actual launch of the Eurex US proposition. I kind of got the scoop on it, but unfortunately, it was right up against the FT's deadline for the first edition of the newspaper. You're talking about roughly 11 a.m. Chicago time, which is sort of getting towards the back end of the afternoon in London, maybe midday Chicago time. I got the story at about 11:15 and had to write a 450-word story in about 10 minutes. I remember I'd never faced a deadline like it. And I got to about 430 words of the 450-word story because they decided they were going to put it on the front page or the front of the second section, the companies and market section or whatever, which is where the big stories would go, especially scoops if you were getting them. And I remember getting phone calls from the desk in London screaming at me, you need to file your story. We need to go to print the damn newspaper. And I had to file the story at 430 words or whatever it was, 440, just shy of the slot in the newspaper that was required of 450 words. And I got a copy of the paper and I saw that there was a gap at the bottom of the story of pink space where the word just hadn't been enough words. I'm not sure that had ever happened in FT history before. And it certainly didn't happen in the rest of my career at the FT, which was a further 20 plus years or so. So I'm afraid I go down in FT history as having created a pink hole in the newspaper.
How did you establish yourself with the Chicago exchange leaders?
At the time, and for decades before and since, has been very much in the privileged position of having great access to the C-suite of any company, pretty much. You don't have to work terribly hard if you're a Financial Times journalist to get the attention of the C-suite in the global corporate world. That sounds a little bit pompous, perhaps, but it's part and parcel of the brand of the FT, is that it allows access. And it allows access for the FT to have conversations with the C-suite that are serious, analytical, and I think that's why the C-suite allows the FT in. And so I very much was able to get into the C-suite of the Chicago Board of Trade and the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, because the FT was bluntly the calling card that it is. And for the Wall Street Journal, it's the same in the United States in particular. They have great access. Bloomberg, I think, also very much has great access. But back then, Bloomberg, I don't think was quite the force that it is now. But I think I worked particularly hard at it because I knew, A, that the FT was the underdog in the US. Wall Street Journal reigned supreme in terms of circulation and profile and history in the US. It was the go-to newspaper for the US business and financial community. However, I also knew that thanks to the work of my predecessors, the FT was particularly favored by the Chicago people like Craig Donoghue, Bernie Dan, Leah Malamed, Jack Sandner, Terry Duffy. All of those folks, Jim McNulty, who was very early on the CEO of the CME when I joined, they all knew the FT already. And they would often say to me, "We read your paper first." And it was true. The FT was known as taking the Chicago exchanges very seriously. I was in a way pushing on an open door, and I could really develop a good relationship with these folks and really get to know what was making this place tick. And it was important to do that because the world outside America needed to know about how the Chicago exchanges were changing the world of their corner of the markets. This was stuff that people needed to know in Tokyo, in Shanghai, in Frankfurt, in London. And that's what the FT delivered.